So first of all, thank you for joining us with this. I know you've been pretty busy, especially after you left Congress, but what have you been doing the last couple of months and how's life been for you?
Well, thanks, Ryan, for having me on. It's been fun. I've spent more time with my family, which is a huge relief after spending 10 years in Congress. So that's been really nice, just being home, spending time with my kids, getting to see more of their stuff, go to more of their events, to the extent there are events right now with the situation with COVID. But it's been fun. It's been good. It's been relaxing. And at the same time, I've been working on getting a couple projects off the ground, and I don't have anything to announce yet, but I want to continue to work in the field of politics, at least in influencing politics, because I think it's important. I think I have a lot of experience to bring to the table.
That is a big tease, by the way, when you said you have a couple projects that you're working on for the future, but can't say anything right now about those.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So you were in Congress for 10 years. What's it like for you now to see what's happening from the outside as a normal, everyday citizen?
Well, it's interesting because it gives me another perspective. I mean, when you're in Congress, you are so immersed in what's going on. And sometimes it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that a lot of people outside of Congress are paying attention. But, when you're outside looking in, you can see how little information people have. I mean, I always understood that as a member of Congress, that people on the outside don't have much information about what's going on inside. They watch you guys on the news. They might watch the national networks and try to figure out what's going on, but it's very hard actually from the outside to know what's going on. And I've been able to experience that myself now. And I think it's important that people on the outside, although we need to hold our politicians accountable, we need to make sure that they're doing the right thing. We also need to appreciate that we don't always have all the information on the outside. And sometimes they're making decisions on the inside based on information we don't have. Now, given my experience in Congress, I know that a lot of them are making decisions without studying, without doing the work, without actually caring about the legislative process. But there are a few people in Congress who do care. And I think it's easy to get down on them because they voted a way that you didn't like without really understanding all the details of the legislation.
When you're talking about the details of the legislation too, how is it, and looking from the outside, especially from my point of view or anybody's point of view, not just a journalist's point of view, but when you guys are given certain documents to look through, legislation to look through, and if it's hundreds of pages, if not thousands of pages, how can people just blindly vote on something like that? Is that something you think needs to change?
Yeah, of course. And people do blindly vote on that stuff. So, my encouragement to people at home is I'm not trying to say, hey, people on the inside are necessarily doing the right thing. Most of the time, I think they're not doing the right thing. But there are some people who are doing the right thing, and they still might vote a way that you don't like. And you have to understand that they might be looking at things that you're not following on the outside or you didn't hear about on the outside. But look, we've got to change the process. It's not okay that hundreds of pages or thousands of pages are dumped on members of Congress, and then they're told to vote on it in an hour or a day. We need real review of this stuff. And nobody would do this in the private sector. You'd never conduct any sort of business transaction like, selling your company or some other, even a personal transaction like a mortgage on a house or something. You wouldn't do that if the person you're dealing with said, okay, you've only got an hour to review this, or, I need to know by this afternoon. People have to take time to make big decisions. And in Congress, they're dealing with decisions that are sometimes trillions of dollars. And they're not given time to review it. And that's unacceptable. And, we can talk about this more later if you'd like. But look, there's a huge centralization problem in Congress where a few people know a lot of stuff and control the whole process. And then a lot of other members of Congress, most members of Congress, are pretty much left in the dark. And that's really detrimental to our system of government. It's definitely detrimental to representative democracy.
Can you talk more about that a little bit? Like when you're talking about people in charge, are you talking about like the the top house Republicans, the top house Democrats, the speakers and that type of thing, and the people who've been there for years and years, that they control most of the stuff that the American public sees?
Yeah, the Speaker of the House has a lot of control. And I was a big critic of the Speaker of the House when a Republican was the Speaker. I was very critical of John Boehner, very critical of Paul Ryan. Probably no one was more critical of Paul Ryan than I was as a member of Congress. And I'm critical of Nancy Pelosi. We have the same problem now. You have a few people at the top, primarily the Speaker and people around the Speaker, only a few members of Congress, really. And then the staff that are connected to the Speaker or connected to maybe some important committees that are working on legislation. They know the stuff, but members of Congress are pretty much left in the dark and then told to just trust the leadership team. And, both parties do that. Both the Republicans and the Democrats do that. And it's really unacceptable. And you're ending up with legislation being voted on that nobody knows anything about. And it just becomes really a game. It's a political game. And, you're siding with your leadership team to get something through, but you have to take their word for it. And a lot of times they end up being wrong.
It almost seems like something from high school, where if you're not part of the popular kids team or part of the popular group, then you're just nobody almost.
Yeah, it is like that. I mean, you are expected to stick with the leadership team. And if you don't, you're considered a pariah. You're on the outs. And this is, again, true of both parties. Even when you're in the minority party, like the Republicans are the minority party right now. But if they don't stick with Kevin McCarthy, they're on the outs. And it means that they won't necessarily get the committee assignments they want. They won't get the legislation brought to the floor that they want to bring to the floor. Because even in the minority party, you might have some legislation that's really simple stuff that's able to come to the floor, and your leadership team will prevent you from bringing it to the floor. So there are a lot of issues with it. I mean, there are campaign issues as well. So they blackmail you on the campaign side. Basically, if you don't stick with the team, they're not going to fund your political campaigns. They're not going to protect you from primary opponents. They're not going to help you as much in the general election if you need some help. So there are a lot of levers that the leaders of both parties pull to try to get you to do what they want. And the exchange a lot of members of Congress make is to not worry about any of the legislation. They figure just stick with the leadership team. Because if they stick with the leadership team, they can get back into Congress and they can continue the gig that they're enjoying right now. If they go rogue, if they go independent in how they conduct themselves, if they start reading the legislation and raising questions about things, then they're on the outs. And they may be doing the righteous thing, but come election time, they're going to be in trouble maybe. So a lot of members of Congress, most members of Congress won't take that route. The incentives are all in the wrong direction right now. And that's a huge problem. And it has to do with the centralization of Congress in just a few people.
I feel like we've seen this happen with your replacement, Peter Meyer, with a top Republican Cheney, who voted for President Trump's impeachment. And then you see these other Republicans pile on top of them, not only publicly, but also on social media. And they're like, we should censor them. We should kick them out of the Republican Party. They shouldn't be here. So it's like people don't really understand what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, and that happens. And when I, took a stance on impeachment when I was in Congress, I had my colleagues, my friends tell me that I was betraying our family, that, this was like a family, the Republican Party, and I was betraying them. And that's how they feel about it. It's not about representing the people anymore. It's about this groupthink. And especially for Republicans and conservatives out there who pride themselves on being independent minded and not bucking or not sticking to the system and being able to buck the system. It's really contrary to that. It's groupthink, and it's dangerous.
We all know that Representative Peter Meyer took over for your position in the 3rd District. Did you ever happen to talk with him before he started? What were some of the words that you guys exchanged, and how do you think he's doing now?
Yeah, we talked quite a bit, and he's someone I've known for a while, and we've been acquaintances for a long time. He came to a lot of my town halls. He spent a lot of time with me over the past few years. Frankly, we've known each other, and um, you know, I encourage them to stay independent, to be a person who thinks for himself, to stand up for himself and stand up for the people he represents. And I think the most important thing you can remember as a representative is that you represent all the people of your district. You don't just represent one party. You don't just represent the people who voted for you. You represent everyone. And so I've encouraged them in that direction. And you know, it's only 2 months in. I think that he's shown himself to be independent in many respects, but we're 2 months in, and I think that you have to give it a while before you can see how a representative is doing. But so far, I've said before, I feel represented in the sense that I feel like he's willing to stand up for what he thinks is right, even if it's independent from the party. But there are a lot of votes ahead, and I think it's hard to judge 2 months in, and it's a very difficult job in that sense. If you really want to do the job, if you really want to represent the people of your district, it can be a very difficult job and a very stressful job, and there are a lot of pressures that come down on you. And that's why most representatives decide that they're not going to represent their district. They're going to represent a political party, because it's a lot easier to do that than to represent the people of your district.
And it seems like that, at least in politics now, is what seems to divide so many people is the letter, the R or the D in front of your name. And as soon as somebody sees that, they're like, oh, you're a Republican, you automatically supported everything that Donald Trump did. Or you're a Democrat, oh, you love Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, which is not always the case. So I guess, how do you think we can move on from that? How do we move on from this person's a Republican and they can't gain my trust anymore because I'm a Democrat, or vice versa?
I think it has to happen at two levels. I mean, it has to happen at the governmental level. You have to have members of Congress who are willing to do the right thing, um, willing to put partisanship aside and stand on principles. And that goes back to centralization in Congress. Can we move away from that? Can we get to a Congress where everyone can participate, where they take a lot of votes and there are a lot of tough votes? Because I think if you have a more deliberative Congress, one that requires people to think, you're also going to get a less partisan Congress. Because if you take a whole host of votes and you put everyone on the record, there's going to be some variation that happens. Right now, you have a few major votes, and that's it. You don't actually have a lot of amendment votes. In fact, in the House of Representatives, I've mentioned this several times, and I think people haven't caught on to how serious it is yet. We haven't been able to offer amendments, or Congress, the House hasn't been able to offer amendments, individual representatives on the House floor since May 2016. So for people who tell their member of Congress, you might call up Representative Meyer and say, hey, can you offer this amendment? He's actually not able to. He can't go to the House floor and offer an amendment. He can submit an amendment sometimes to the Rules Committee, but the Rules Committee is run by the Speaker of the House. And then the Speaker can, nix that amendment before it gets to the House floor, so that members of Congress aren't even able to vote on it. So that is a huge problem, and that needs to be addressed. We need Congress to be a deliberative body. And if they are a deliberative body, I think you will move away from partisanship quite a bit. It's not going to completely resolve partisanship. I mean, bias and partisanship are in some sense natural and inherent. They're part of human nature. But you can move away from that quite a bit, I think, if you allow people to actually deliberate and vote and force them to think for themselves on more items. When they don't have to do that, when they can just walk into Congress and they don't have that many votes and they can't actually participate in the legislative process, you shouldn't be surprised that they turn to attacks on personalities. When they don't actually have to consider legislation, what are they going to focus on? They're going to focus on how bad the other person is, how bad the other team is. It becomes hyperbolic, and it's just about personalities and identity rather than legislation. So that's not surprising. But we also have work to do at home. Those of us at home have work to do in trying to understand our neighbors and people around us, and not assuming that the people we know are all the people of our community. A lot of times it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, all my neighbors or all my friends think this way, so everyone must think that way. When actually you go a few blocks down the road, people think very differently. And I think we need to appreciate that we have differences of opinion and respect each other, and learn to do a better job of trusting each other.
I have another follow-up after that, but what was the May 16th or May 2016 thing that happened that didn't allow lawmakers to issue amendments?
Yeah, so Paul Ryan in May 2016 decided that Democrats were offering too many difficult votes. In other words, they were coming to the floor and putting amendment votes on the House floor that were challenging for many Republicans. And Paul Ryan went to the Republican conference and said, look, guys, these Democrats are putting tricky amendments on the floor. And so to keep you guys from getting into any trouble, I'm just going to stop allowing amendments on the House floor. We're not going to have amendments on the House floor anymore. You're going to submit your amendments to the Rules Committee to the extent we have amendments. And he said he'd approve the ones that are good, and most people would get their amendments through. And then some of these super tricky ones that are challenging and put on by the Democrats, he said, we'll nix those amendments. We won't allow those. And, I objected at the time because I believe that the House has to be a deliberative body that discovers outcomes. And I think we should take all of those votes, and we should take tough votes. We should be forced to go on the record on challenging items. We should be forced to think about this stuff. And if it means that we get a difficult campaign ad put against us, so what? That's part of the job. We have to be challenged. We have to be put under pressure because we're representatives. And I objected to it, and I understood what was going on, that he made it sound like only a few amendments were going to get cut out. But actually what ended up happening was a whole bunch of amendments got stopped. And from that point forward, Congress has been extremely closed down. It was pretty closed down before, but in the House of Representatives, it is basically completely shut down. I would say that you essentially do not have a legislative process anymore in the House of Representatives. You have a few people who get together in the leadership team, usually on the majority side, but sometimes working with minority leadership, and they decide what's going to happen. And then the rest of the members of Congress are just pawns to press the button, yes or no. And they know which button to press if they're going to, maintain their position in Congress. They're going to stick with whatever button their leadership team tells them to press.
Yeah, and I mean, that's pretty bold and shocking to say. Like, obviously, you could probably see my face when you said that the whole point of Congress and the legislative process, you just basically said it's not really there anymore. It's
not really there. And I don't say that lightly because, I'm not a guy who is going to be hyperbolic about this stuff. I kind of, spoken out against that in Congress. I hate the entertainment side of it. In fact, over the years, I haven't even done that many interviews like this. I'm not a guy who's seeking the spotlight, and I don't care for it. I wanted to be a legislator. I went to Congress to be a legislator, to actually work on legislation, not to be an entertainer. So I don't say this lightly. I say it with seriousness, that Congress doesn't work. You don't have a representative system of government. We essentially have an oligarchy. And that is a serious statement to make, because I love this country and I love our system of government. I love the system that some very intelligent people put together, and we've improved that system over the years. We've made it better so that it could be, at least our Constitution has improved so that it could be more democratic, more representative, and frankly, more libertarian, with people's rights protected better. And with all those changes we've made to improve the system and make it into what could be a very great system, Congress is completely dysfunctional. We don't use the system we have. The system we're using now is one that is not reflective of our Constitution and not a representative system of government.
Do you think it can be fixed?
I think it can be fixed, but I don't think it's going to happen from the inside. And I say that from experience. I was working on the inside and I've tried all sorts of things. Even the House Freedom Caucus was something I tried and it totally went awry. I can't even recognize the House Freedom Caucus anymore. It's nothing like the institution I tried to establish. The whole point of the House Freedom Caucus was to open up the process and make it less partisan and make it more of a deliberative process and open up the body so that everyone can participate on the right and the left. And it's completely gone awry to the point where the House Freedom Caucus is basically just some kind of right-wing proxy of the Republican Party. And that was not the intention of it. So I tried that. I tried working with leadership. I tried working against leadership. I've tried being an independent in Congress. I've tried being a libertarian in Congress. So I've tried different approaches to try to get the system to change from within. And I was very nonpartisan. I worked with Democrats all the time. I was willing to work with Republicans on a whole host of issues as well. And it just never worked. I think it's too rigid on the inside. You can't break through. Certainly one person can't break through. And it's hard to get a team of, say, 30, 40, or 50 people together because they're all suffering from these same incentives from leadership to just stick with the leadership team. So you can't actually get a group to break away from the pack and do the right thing. And so it's really disheartening, but I don't think it can be changed from the inside. I think you have to change it from the outside. And that's where I think I come in right now, because I'm working from the outside. I'm trying to get people at home to understand what's going on. And I hope on the outside, I can do more of the stuff that I didn't really want to do that much on the inside. I didn't really want to, be as much of a public figure on the inside, honestly. I liked doing legislative work. That's what I wanted to do. But now I recognize that this focus on the legislative work without really fixing the system is futile. So I've got to actually take a more public profile in many respects now and try to get this thing fixed so that in the future people can go to Congress and can make a difference. And right now, I don't think they can make that difference.
Can you talk about some of those incentives that you just mentioned, that as the pawns, what are some of these people getting when they follow the leadership and just vote how they want them to?
They're getting taken out to dinner. They're getting money. I mean, they get campaign resources. In reverse, they also don't get money withheld. So if you don't stick with leadership, not only do you get money if you stick with leadership, but if you don't stick with leadership, they will call up people and say, don't donate to this person. They'll call up individual donors. They'll definitely call up PACs and say, don't support this person. If you stick with the leadership team, you'll get the committee assignments you want. You might get a chairmanship or a ranking member position on a committee. You will get more legislation brought to the floor. And a lot of the legislation that's brought to the floor, to the extent, it does anything, it's pretty minimal because most of the serious stuff is handled in a few large bills now. But, people like to bring legislation to the floor so they can claim they got something passed in Congress and they can run a campaign ad saying that they got something done, even if it's not that consequential. And a lot of the people who stick with leadership, they get those pieces of legislation on the floor and they get to say they got something passed. And they know that people at home don't really know what's in the bill. So if it sounds like it's something that helps veterans or seniors or something, even if it doesn't do that much, it will sell with the public. And so they like to have that. And the leadership team will offer that kind of stuff. And in fact, a lot of members of Congress, most members of Congress aren't writing their own legislation. I mean, they are receiving legislation Sometimes they're copying legislation, but other times they're just receiving legislation from members of leadership who say, look, we've got an idea for you. You can bring this to the floor. And all it takes is sticking with the team, and you can get that piece of legislation brought to the floor in your name. And I know a lot of colleagues who had legislation brought to the floor and they didn't even know what the legislation was because they didn't write it.
It almost sounds like what you're describing is literally House of Cards in real life.
Yeah, I think actually House of Cards is more functional than real life Congress. I mean, I watched House of Cards. I didn't care that much for like the last season or two, but I think it's more functional than Congress. In House of Cards, the people actually seem to care about the legislation much more than they do in Congress. Like you'd see episodes of House of Cards where they're really concerned about getting particular legislation through and what's in it. And in Congress, mostly they don't care about that stuff. They don't care that much about the details. They care about the message, and the details are secondary. And most of them don't even know the details, and they're not that interested in it. So, yeah, it's disturbing. It's dysfunctional, and at the same time, I think people at home can fix this problem. You know, but it takes people at home caring about the process side of it, not just caring about the substance. I'll give you a good example. Like you take some of this legislation that's going through right now. Say, you get a relief bill, like $2 trillion, and the Democrats are pushing it. And at other times when Republicans are majority, they're pushing stuff. What ends up happening is a lot of the media don't really focus on the process. They really don't care whether the members of Congress read the legislation. They're not that interested in it. If you look at news reports on legislation, how often do they talk about whether the members of Congress really had time to review it or what the actual details are other than the very top line numbers? Like, there will be like 4 or 5 things that they focus on, and the bill might be like 1,000 pages, or in some cases 5,000 pages. We had to vote on one that was, I think, 5,600 pages. How often are the actual details of this legislation discussed, and how often is the process actually discussed? And instead, what happens a lot of time is you have cheerleading for getting stuff done for the sake of getting it done. I know that legislation often cares. It contains things that are very important to people, and I understand why they want to get some of that stuff through. But people at home also have to care about the process that's happening, because you may like that one thing that's in the bill, or you may like 5 things that are in the bill, but you may not like 30 things that are in the bill. And you don't know about those things. And those things are so harmful, they may outweigh the 5 things that you do like. And a lot of times media don't focus on that. And as a result, the public's not focused on it. And members of Congress certainly aren't focused on it because, like I said, they have these incentives not to pay attention to the legislation. But also, they don't even have time to review the legislation, which is, again, it's a scheme by leaders to get them not to scrutinize it. If you don't give them time to review it, they're not going to scrutinize it. And they're much more likely to stick with the team, because their alternative is to go out on a limb and go against something with, uncertain information. They don't really know what's in it. And, they're very likely to just stick with their team and do what their team told them to do.
It almost sounds like the headlines that you sometimes see on national networks too, where it says, local senator votes against money for children with cancer, but they don't say anything about the bill that says, oh, we wanted to also give $300 million to a foreign country that had nothing to do with the bill. That's kind of what almost like.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's stuff like that all the time. And it's unfortunate, but the media are in the same boat as a lot of members of Congress, because I'm very critical at the media at times, because I think that there is at times an agenda that is at odds with our system of government. There's also a lot of media who are in the same boat as members of Congress, who some of them do care about what's in it, but they also don't have time. You just like a member of Congress are going to get a 5,600 page bill put in front of you, and you have to report on it. And you've got to say, is this, what's in it? And you don't have time to review it. You're not reading the bill. This is a problem. It's a problem that we don't have media who are willing to scrutinize it or who have the time to scrutinize it. And again, this goes back to congressional leadership and the idea that it's rushed through. And I really do wish that more in the media would step up and say, look, we have to also understand what's in this legislation because the American people deserve to know. And it may sound really good. And there may, in fact, be a good reason to pass this thing, but let's really understand it. Let's review it. And this excuse that's often given that, well, if you give members of Congress a week to review something, we're holding off helping out the American people. Members of Congress are often left in the dark for weeks or months while legislation is being worked on secretly. And you don't hear any criticisms of, or very few criticisms of these leaders who are secretly working on legislation for months when they could have just put the bill on the House floor. They could have deliberated it for a week or two, allowed people to offer amendments, and they could have resolved it pretty quickly. But take last year, Pelosi, along with McConnell, so it was both Democratic and Republican leaders, they could have worked on relief legislation. They could have worked on it for months, and they held off and held off and held off and held off. And it went till past the election. They could have put that on the floor and allowed people to deliberate and resolved it a lot sooner. Yet they received very little criticism from the media or even the public, because the public are following the media's lead, about how long it took. And then when they finally put the bill on the floor, and it's finally time to, where members of Congress should be able to at least scrutinize it now, then it said, oh, we got to hurry. We got to rush this thing through. We don't have time. The American people need help. You got to pass this in, half a day. So they work on it for months. Then they offer it to members of Congress and say, here it is. Here's 5,600 pages. And then they say, oh, we're in such a rush. We got to do this in half a day. Well, you guys just took several months to write this thing secretly, without any scrutiny, without any of us reviewing it. And now you're telling us it's such a rush. We've got to do it in half a day. Give me a break. And yet, I don't think enough in the media call this behavior out and say, this is unacceptable. Instead, what ends up happening, and I'm not trying to pick on you, but instead what ends up happening, especially when I watch a lot of the national media like CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, is there's this euphoria. Oh, isn't it great that they're getting something done? Isn't it great? Look, Republicans and Democrats are coming together to get something done. And isn't that wonderful? Because they're finally getting something done for the American people. And so the cycle gets perpetuated because it's reinforced. The leaders in Congress, they hear this stuff and they say, look, we're not going to face any criticism for operating the way we do. In fact, we're going to be praised for it. We're going to do all this stuff behind the scenes in secret. Then we're going to drop a bill on members of Congress' desk and tell them they have a few hours to go on it. And then instead of criticizing us, the media are going to praise us for getting something done. So the incentives are all backwards. And I think it's going to take people at home standing up and saying, this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable from Congress, and it's unacceptable from media, that we have to change the way we operate. And we really need scrutiny of the entire process.
And it's totally fine that you pick on me and being in the media, because I agree with you. And I know that, like, when it comes to these pages, we don't have time. We don't even have time to almost look through 100 pages if we're trying to get something on today, let alone 5,000. And so I know that I've tried to file several FOIAs in terms of, related to unemployment. And sometimes it's like a delay of 5 days, and then you get a 10-day extension. So it's like, even if you try to ask, why are there 5,000 pages? You don't really get an answer from anybody. And I think that's something else that needs change too.
Yep, absolutely.
So talking about legislation, I know that you had the Qualified Immunity Act that you co-sponsored when you were in Congress. And now that the police officer who killed George Floyd is on trial, Derek Chauvin, what is it like for you to know that there's a representative in Massachusetts who has now reintroduced that bill, and it's gotten the support of both senators in Massachusetts as well?
Well, I think it's great that Ayanna Pressley, who's a representative who I worked with on this legislation in the previous Congress, that she's taking the lead on it again, and she's pushing it forward. And it really should be a nonpartisan issue. It's not about whether or not you support police officers. I think the vast majority of Americans are supportive of police officers, understand they have difficult jobs, but we also want to make sure that police officers are held accountable when they do wrong, just like anyone should be held accountable when they do wrong. And there is a law on the books. It's been around for a long time. It's a civil rights law, and it says that when a government official, and it could be a police officer, it could be any government official, when a government official violates your rights, you are empowered to sue that person, that person can be held liable. And there's this doctrine called qualified immunity that's developed, and it was developed by the Supreme Court. So it's not actually done through legislation. The Supreme Court just came up with it. And it basically provides immunization for government officials, including police officers, when they do wrong. And it says that if there's not a prior case on the books where an officer or a government official has been charged with this offense and found liable, then you can't hold the current person liable for that offense. So there has to be some clearly established law, as they put it, that shows that this is the wrong thing to do. So even if a case goes all the way to, say, the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, what this officer did was unconstitutional and violated this person's rights. If there's not an existing case on the books where someone else had already done that thing, then that officer can get qualified immunity. And we think that's wrong. We think that if you violate someone's rights, it shouldn't matter whether someone else has done the same thing before. If you just because you came up with some new way to violate someone's rights doesn't mean you should be given immunity. And right now that's the case. You come up with some new way to violate someone's rights, you get immunity. And that has to be fixed. And it can be fixed by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has taken some very small steps to address it in some recent cases, but not enough. And I'm concerned that this immunity will continue, and government officials will continue to get away with violating people's rights, and we should put a stop to that. And for those who are concerned about, police officers making split-second decisions, that's already protected. All of those things are already protected under constitutional law. So it has nothing to do with qualified immunity. It's a separate issue. All of those ideas, like the fact that it's a very difficult job and there's a lot of stress and they have to make split-second decisions, there are already constitutional decisions related to those issues, which give some leeway to police officers and understand the circumstances. So those things are already protected. What we're saying is when someone very clearly violates someone's rights, and it's very obvious to everyone, including the court, that rights were violated, that person should be held liable. And it's that simple.
Sorry, earlier you were talking about the fact that a lot of politicians are in this game, I guess, of being on TV, the entertainment aspect of it. And it seems like a lot of them are more worried about posting on social media or showing up on national news networks, bashing the other side, other than just getting things done. Do you think this is where Congress is going in the future? How do we get away from all of these people just commenting on everything or posting everything online about the other party?
Yeah, I think this is where Congress is headed. And because Congress works this way, and candidates are starting to understand that it works this way, you're starting to recruit now new members of Congress who are specialists in this kind of entertainment Congress. You're recruiting entertainers and actors who want to come and just perform for people rather than legislate, because people at home who are considering running for office are starting to understand they actually don't do that much legislative work in Congress. It's really just an acting gig. So yeah, you're going to continue to encourage this kind of behavior if Congress doesn't change. And again, if we open up the process, if we forced everyone to take a lot of votes and take very difficult votes and force them to participate in the legislative process, which is what you should do as a legislator, I think that you would move away from a lot of this entertainment aspect of Congress. But right now, what else do they have to work on when you think about it? They're told they can't read the bills. They don't have time they're not going to be given time to read the bills. They can't offer amendments. What are they going to do other than entertain you? They're going to go on TV and they're going to be actors. It shouldn't surprise anyone. In fact, if you're not these days, if you're not in the entertainment business in Congress, you really don't have that much to do, at least when you're in DC, like on the legislative side. There's always constituent work that's happening where your constituent services district office is working on stuff. But when you're in Washington, if you can't work on legislative work, what are you going to do other than entertain? And that's really unfortunate. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to get out. I didn't run for Congress to be an entertainer. I like tweeting and posting stuff on social media as much as anyone, but I also want that stuff to be informative, and I want it to be related to legislation. I don't want it to be, and I didn't really participate in this kind of stuff where it's just let's bash the other party, let's bash members of Congress. I don't think that's healthy or useful. And, everyone engages in that from time to time. And I understand why you might criticize a particular member from time to time. And I certainly did that too. But when it becomes the whole job, that's a problem. That should not be the majority of your job. The majority of your job should be working on legislation. And right now, that's not happening.
We know that we've seen a lot on social media in terms of lately it's been Governor Cuomo in New York. A couple of weeks ago, it was Ted Cruz going on a flight down to Mexico when his own state a lot of it was without power because of the storm that moved through. Do you think it's more negative than the impact that social media has, or can there be a positive impact as well as, like you were saying, getting information out to the public?
Yeah, I mean, it's both positive and negative. At this point, I'm not sure whether it's whether we're better off or worse off. When I first got into Congress, I was pretty sure that social media was a positive thing because I could use it to explain legislation. I could use it to detail every one of my votes. I was getting information out there in a way that no one had before. And it was, I think, a useful medium to inform the public and to have interaction with people like we've never had before. And those are really positive things. But it has really devolved into just a game of partisanship and just name calling and attacking and ganging up on people. And then you have a lot of people who are just anonymous on social media, and then they just troll people or hide behind their anonymity to say the most vile things. And so, or even people who aren't anonymous, they're more willing, when they don't have to say it to your face, to just go say horrible things, not just to politicians, they say it to each other. And it's really hurt discourse on social media, where a lot of, I think, sane, rational people, which are the majority of the population, like, you look at the 3rd district of Michigan, most people are pretty moderate. Most people are pretty rational, reasonable, sensible people. Like it's not, most districts around the country are like this, but certainly in West Michigan, we have a lot of reasonable people who make up the majority of the population. But I think a lot of them don't even feel like going on social media because it's so disgusting. And so they end up just removing themselves from the discussion altogether.
And sometimes there are some of us in the news business who wish we could do that. I mean, I know I have my social media, my Facebook and my Twitter, but it's like, if I get rid of those, then I get rid of all the ways that I can communicate. So sometimes I stay off it, but I got rid of it on my actual personal phone. But speaking of posting on social media, I do still follow you. Obviously, you're still very involved in politics. And a tweet that stood out to me the other day is one from the ACLU that said, "Decriminalize sex work," and you were in favor of that. So talk about that. And a lot of the comments as well under it were basically saying, if two consenting adults agree to have sex with each other and somebody wants to pay the other one, they should be allowed to do that. And like we mentioned, we were talking about alcohol being banned years ago. We were talking about marijuana being illegal years ago. And now you're seeing, the recreational use being allowed. Do you think the same thing will happen with sex work? And do you think it should?
Yeah, I think it should. And again, this is not a matter of ethics or morals. I mean, people can have their own morals and ethics and say for religious reasons, they don't want to interact with people who are doing that stuff, or they don't want to watch it themselves or engage with it. And that's fine. I think that's all fine. And in fact, there are a lot of people, certainly in West Michigan, who will feel that way. But when people are consenting and they're not harming other people, that's between them. And I don't think we should have laws on the books preventing people from engaging in acts that are consensual and not harmful to each other. Now, this is a separate issue from sex trafficking. Obviously there is a real problem of sex trafficking that exists in the world, and we should address that. But we shouldn't try to throw it all together and treat all consensual sexual relations that are, online or whatever as sex trafficking, because that's just not the case. And I think that's often used as sort of a boogeyman to shut down consensual acts. So we can go after sex trafficking and prevent that, while at the same time allowing consenting people to do what they believe in. And I do think that eventually this will come to be. I think we are moving in a direction that is more libertarian in that sense in many areas. Marijuana is a good example of that. And I do think that we are moving in a more libertarian direction in that respect.
Okay, so you campaigned first as a Republican. You obviously voted to impeach President Trump and then switched to independent before going to libertarian. What do you want people to know about your current party that they may not know right now, or that they may not understand about it?
There are a lot of misconceptions, and I think the most important thing to understand is that it's about protecting people's rights. That's the fundamental basis of libertarianism and the Libertarian Party. It's focused on protecting people's rights. There are people who think that it is on the right side of the aisle, right versus left. And I would say that's not correct. It's neither right nor left. It's more like a triangle. And if you put, libertarians on one corner of the triangle and Democrats and Republicans on the other corners. So it's a party that's about protecting people's rights. And I think most Americans are pretty libertarian. And if I looked at the population as a whole, and I know this having worked as a legislator, I think that there is a considerable number of people, 30-40%, who could be libertarians and vote within the Libertarian Party. And I want to grow that party and make it a challenger to the other two major parties, because I think those parties aren't really representing people that well. And the Republican Party has moved in a much more nationalist, populist, anti-liberty direction. And I think the Democratic Party has become more of a coastal elite party. And I don't think that that's very good for our country either. So we need a party that represents a broad swath of Americans, that's going to be about protecting people's rights, and that's not going to focus just on, hating the other party, but that has its own ideas and own vision for where things should go. And like I said, the Libertarian Party is about protecting rights. We want to end some of the wars that are going, end all the wars, frankly, because none of the current wars are constitutionally authorized. And I'd say if not all are immoral right now, most of them are immoral. We want to allow people to make decisions for themselves. We want to protect people's privacy and protect people's civil liberties. We want to protect your rights online and protect your Fourth Amendment rights and protect freedom of speech. So there are a lot of areas where, people from both the Republican side and the Democratic side would find a home in the Libertarian Party. And I hope to keep pushing that as I go forward in this path.
That's definitely leading me to my next question. Speaking of the path, I know you're going to be 41 next month. Do you have any aspirations of running for anything in state office, maybe governor or Debbie Stabenow's seat when she's up for election, or what are your plans moving forward?
Well, I really haven't thought about any of that. I'm not opposed to running for office again. I think that I have experience and skills to offer as a candidate, but I'm not really thinking about any of that stuff right now. I want to focus on getting information to the public and helping educate people about the way politics really works, because I don't think that we can fix any of the problems on the inside until we fix the process issues on the inside. And that's going to take people on the outside caring about the functioning of Congress. So I could come with all of my libertarian ideas and bring them to Congress or bring them to any office. But if the system doesn't actually function properly, we can't really debate those ideas, deliberate, or have any real discussion. So right now I'm focused on just educating and getting information out to people about my experience. And then in the future, who knows?
And if more people do seem to care now about Congress and how things are running, what is the one thing that can change? If people do say, you know what, I agree with Justin, I think we need to stop bashing the other side. I think there's good things on both sides. I think we need to stop this, 50-50 partisanship thing going on. What is like the one thing that needs to change, or what can people do in order to change the way that their government runs?
Well, I think that people should care a lot and vote this way, vote on the basis of whether people will follow process. That you need to make process as important as the substantive issues. So whether someone is reading the legislation, understanding the legislation, whether people are allowed to have amendments, and how do members of Congress feel about that stuff, that needs to be something people consider at home. Not just the substantive issues, like are you pro-life or pro-choice, or are you pro-death penalty or anti-death penalty, or whatever it might be, whatever the issue might be. People have their opinions on these things, but if you don't have a real process in place to debate any of these ideas, none of that matters. You can't actually make any difference in Congress or in any other office. I mean, there are process issues in other offices as well. So people need to focus on that. And then I also think we need to come together as people. We need to start listening to each other and respecting each other more, and stop worrying about whether someone is a Republican or a Democrat or a libertarian. Just have conversations and appreciate each other, as human beings. I think we don't do enough of that anymore. We've gotten to the point where people don't talk to family members because they vote in a different party, or because they like Trump or don't like Trump, or they like Biden or don't like Biden. This kind of stuff is silly in terms of whether you should, talk to your neighbor or talk to your family member, or have a good relationship with people. So let's get back to where we can have real conversations with people, and then talk about ideas and try to persuade people about our ideas, instead of trying to defeat them and crush them and hating on them.
Well, you answered all my questions. That's an hour worth. I didn't know it would last that long, but is there anything else that you want to add or say before I end this?
Well, just, I'm honored to have served the district for all those years. And so for anyone watching who's from the district, I just want to say thank you again for giving me that honor. I woke up every day feeling very humbled, and it was an awesome feeling knowing that people had put their trust in me, and I took that very seriously. And I hope that all our representatives will take it seriously. I don't think that's the case right now with Congress, but I hope people will, because it is an incredible honor. And I'll continue to try to do things that will be to the benefit of the district and the United States. You know, I think that we need to come together as a people, and I'll continue to work in that direction.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ryan.